Good afternoon. Welcome to the session. I think we'll start now, and hopefully there may be others that join us. So welcome to those of you in the room. Welcome to everybody who's joining us online. My name is Pia Oberoi. I'm Senior Advisor at the UN Human Rights Office's regional office based here in Bangkok, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today for our session on advertising as a lever for change, confronting hate speech and discrimination. Before I hand over to our panel, I just wanted to make a few opening remarks. Advertising is a multi-billion-dollar industry globally, and the Asia-Pacific region is home to some of the world's largest advertising markets, including, of course, China and Japan, who are the second and third largest markets in the world, as well as others in the region, India, Australia, Indonesia, and others. This year in the Asia-Pacific industry, there has been an estimated annual spend of about $250 billion, with between half to two-thirds of this budget now being allocated to digital media. This spending power, coupled with its reach into homes and communities, means that the advertising industry has enormous capacity to impact people's lives in both positive and negative ways. When advertising actors make ethical, informed, and human rights-based decisions, advertising dollars can serve to support constructive, representative narratives and uphold independent and vibrant media that empowers individuals and communities. But when decisions are not rights-based, advertising spending funds disinformation and hate speech that incites discrimination, hostility, and even violence, displacing positive messages with harmful narratives that result in real-world, real-life harms. Indeed, ads promoted on extremist and disinformation websites are estimated to generate more than $235 million revenue annually. As the United Nations Secretary General has noted, fear is the best-selling brand in the world today. It gets ratings, it wins votes, it generates clicks. But such profits can come at a cost to human rights. In this region, as in many others, it is increasingly profitable to stoke fear and hatred. And we have been observing with increasing concern that migrants and other minorities are being singled out and demonized as easy scapegoats for social problems, that coordinated disinformation is hampering effective climate action and interfering with public health strategies, such as in the context of COVID-19 response. In a fast-changing and increasingly fast-paced media landscape, moderate and rights-based voices are all too often overshadowed by extremist views. Social media, which is of course premised on the amplification of resonant messages, tends especially to reward simplicity and to discourage nuance, pushing consumers of such content towards extremes. Along with a host of other human rights concerns, the rights to privacy, free expression, and information are being jeopardized. From the perspective of the UN Human Rights Office, our session today follows in the step of ongoing engagement with our partners in the Conscious Advertising Network to promote a conversation with advertisers, companies, civil society, governments, and other stakeholders around rights-based and ethical advertising practices, believing that this engagement is key to harnessing the levers of change and effectively tackling the funding and spread of hate and disinformation in our societies. It is also key to ensuring diversity and inclusion and amplifying values-based messaging as a counter to damaging societal narratives. Through our work on public narrative change, we are keen to support a broad conversation on how we can work together with partners to paint a picture of the communities we want to live in, moving away from a constant rebuttal of who we are not to showcasing who we are. This is also a foundational aspect of the prevention agenda and the leaving no one behind principle that is so fundamental to the UN, to interrogate the kind of invisibility that marginalizes minorities, migrants, and others, and leaves them vulnerable to the pernicious effects of hate speech and disinformation. We have an excellent panel with us here today to discuss these issues, and I will introduce them as they speak, but I'd like to welcome them to our conversation today, where we will discuss issues such as concerns, promising practices, as well as lessons learned on the links between human rights and advertising, tools that business partners can use to ensure that their advertising is ethical and human rights based, and partnerships between business actors, media, and civil society, including community-based actors, to confront disinformation and hate in the context of the media and advertising. So to start, I would like to give the floor to our co-organizing partner, Jake Dubbins, who is co-founder of the Conscious Advertising Network, and ask Jake, could you explain to the audience how advertising works today and what it is funding? What is the Conscious Advertising Network and what are your priorities?
Thanks, Pia, and it's really great to be here and to be organising this panel with you and your colleagues at the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So firstly, this is normally I talk at advertising conferences, so I'm aware that this isn't that. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about how this problem works and the scale, I guess, of the problem that that Pia has outlined. So firstly, just a little bit about this organization. So it's an organization of over 150 big brands, big agency groups, and critically civil society groups all around the world. That includes GSK, Group M, Havas Media, for example. And we set up to specifically look at how to break the economic link between advertising and the harmful content that threatens human rights, but also to promote conscious investment in diverse and inclusive advertising. Ultimately, as Pia has just outlined, advertising funds the internet. It literally funds all of the social media platforms. We don't have Google, we don't have Facebook without advertising. But with that sort of sense of scale, with that power comes responsibility. And so we focus on 7 different areas of harm: misinformation, hate speech, diversity, inclusion, and equity. We've just launched a climate and sustainability manifesto as well. Children's well-being, informed consent, and fraud, all of which permeates through this massive ecosystem. Pia talked about the fact that 250 billion is spent in the Asia-Pacific region on advertising. Globally, the number is 760 billion. Which is an enormous amount of money funding the narratives that shape our lives. But those narratives are also being prey to misinformation. So top brands, this was some research done by NewsGuard and Comscore, top brands are sending $2.6 billion to misinformation websites every year. And they don't know they're doing it. So this advertising ecosystem is no longer where advertisers choose to partner with specific media outlets that they trust, that they've built a relationship with. This is a huge ecosystem powered by advertising technology, which means that a brand's adverts can be on tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, websites across the world, and actually auditing that is nigh on impossible. So that sort of transparency is simply not there in the industry currently. So this is just a little bit of an explanation about how that system works. So this is one of our partners, Check My Ads. They're based in the US. And on the left-hand side of this diagram, you can see advertisers like Ruchira here from Diageo. And within the central part, this sort of big black box of what we call advertising technology is the $400 billion digital advertising industry. And through that black box, then the adverts appear on the publishers that you can see there on the right-hand side. And some of those publishers are, publishers that you want your adverts to appear on, but some of them, as you can see from the orange box there, are disinformation sites, and then ultimately going on to the consumers that you're talking to as a brand. And just to reveal a little bit more of this, and again, this is a Check My Ads diagram, but you can see again how this works. So it goes from the advertiser to the media agency, to the trading desk, to the demand side provider, to the ad exchange, to the supply side provider, and then into the publishers. So it's hugely complex, and there's money being made at every single level. Actually, in the UK, there was a piece of research done on the programmatic advertising supply chain that revealed that 15% of the money spent, they called an unknown delta. So this was done by the UK advertising body ISBA with PwC. So 15% of that money, nobody knows where it's gone. So if you make that $400 billion in the advertising digital supply chain, that's 60 billion. Nobody knows where that money goes. So this is the exploitation of this system, and at all stages, money can leak out to disinformation and hate speech websites. So what do I mean by that? So just preparing for this talk, I did a little bit of research in terms of one of the things that's going on currently. So in the UK currently, there is different groups within Leicester, conflict in Leicester and unrest in Leicester between Hindu groups and Muslim groups. This is an Indian website that I brought up, saying that any area where Muslims exist is a no-go zone for non-Muslims. Clearly, that's not true, but if you look at the ads there, so the ads you can see there, monetized by Google in the ad tech supply chain, that's the Bangkok Float Centre placing ads on an Indian website, spreading disinformation about a situation in a town in England. So you can see that the Bangkok Float Centre probably didn't strike a deal with that site to place their ads there. So as you can see, these are ads that the original advertiser has no idea where they are. And as you can see, the mayor in Leicester has blamed that unrest on social media disinformation. So these are confected stories fomenting polarization between different groups all over the world. So again, how's this relevant to the Asia Pacific region? Well, in 2019, a terrorist walked into 2 mosques in New Zealand and killed 51 people. The manifesto was called the Great Replacement. So for those of you unfamiliar with the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, this is a white nationalist far-right conspiracy theory that states with the complicity and cooperation of replacist elites, white populations are being deliberately replaced by black people and people of color through mass migration. So this is a false misinformation conspiracy theory that says this is deliberately happening. Clearly, migration is taking place, but this is a massive conspiracy theory that's gaining traction all over the world. The New Zealand terrorist had links to a far-right Austrian group called Generation Identity, who talk about the Great Replacement and talk about things like remigration and things called ethno-pluralism, which actually means people living individually and being deported if they're not from that particular country. So it isn't multicultural at all. This is ethno-pluralism, means that everybody that is, for example, not of a white background should be deported from Northern European countries. This is Martin Sellner, the leader of Generation Identity, on YouTube. And this is how the monetization works. So he's talking about his conspiracy theories there, but Peloton was, at that particular point, advertising on those racist conspiracy theories. They don't know that they're doing that. And now we have a progressive and productive partnership with Google, who own YouTube, to take and demonetize and take this sort of stuff down. Because critically, it's not just the narratives that are spreading, but this is an economic model. Not only are these narratives spreading around the world, people are earning an awful lot of money from spreading these misinformation narratives. As Pia said, hate is the biggest brand in the world because it sells eyeballs, and where there's eyeballs, advertising exists. In Myanmar, and no colleagues from Amnesty will talk about this a little later on, but back in 2018, an independent report was commissioned by Facebook saying that the platform had created an enabling environment for human rights abuse in Myanmar. That was not largely because, but one of the reasons was because there was no local speaking moderators, content moderators in Myanmar at that particular time. So there were human rights abuses going on the platform with no ability to track, monitor, or indeed moderate that content. Fast forward to November last year, and an Associated Press report is still finding posts threatening murder and rape in Myanmar. And then only this year, Global Witness have done some research both in Kenya, also in Ethiopia and in Myanmar, where they set ads up containing direct hate speech, direct incitement to violence, and genocide in Myanmar. And those ads went past the controls of Facebook. They never went live, so Facebook might have picked those up once they had gone live, but they'd gone through some of those checks and balances up front. So as you can see, this is a huge problem. It is not just a problem of narrative, it is a problem of incentivization of the money that is earned through hate speech and misinformation. And as our work with PIA continues, our aim is to build a big tent of brands, agencies, civil society groups, and working constructively with the platforms to solve these clear and present dangers. I'll stop there. I know that otherwise I'll rattle on all day.
Thank you very much, Jake, and thank you really for painting also literally a very compelling picture of how these chains work and bringing up the economic model really that we're up against in a sense of trying to bring that change that you talked about. I'll move on now to our second panelist, who's sadly not able to join us here in Bangkok, but will join us online, Amir Malik, who is the Managing Director of Accenture Song. And I hope that he is here with us today. Hi, Amir. From the perspective of one of the major consultancies, both in the region and globally, Amir, can you just talk us through some of your thoughts on the issues that we've been hearing today? How are you approaching these very complex issues related to digital advertising? And it would be great to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Yes, firstly, thank you for inviting me, Pia. Good to hear you. And I could listen to Jake rattle on all day, actually, because it's what we need to hear. It's what we need to know. The world around us is changing. I guess I'd kick it off and probably continue on the same theme as Jake, that, we often talk about or try to define the internet, but people also ask who controls it. And I think the answer to that question is he who controls, or one who controls, the distribution of content. And so all of us are seeking information. All human beings have a sort of predisposition to want to know information, to want to digest information. So we go online to do that. The reason that we can access that information for free in most circumstances, the majority, is because it's ad funded, as Jake outlined. But when we talk about what sort of information that is, if you take just one of the platforms, 500 hours of video content is uploaded every minute on YouTube. Just to contemplate that for a second. Yeah, that's not 500 hours every hour, that's 500 hours of content every minute. And we live in a new world of content creation. So people can literally become famous overnight if their video goes viral. Bad news travels fast. YouTube has 2 billion active users. So just think about the human population. 2 billion human beings are active on YouTube, right? So that's defined in a 72-hour period, I believe, that they're using YouTube. So once you start to compute that level of reach and depth, I think the argument that the access to an open economy of information is productive and beneficial to humankind, I think is a strong one. But what we're finding is that if you take 2021, from what could be tracked, $300 million of advertising funds went towards disinformation. So that's what we could track. What we can't track, the number is estimated to be far higher. And as you start to think about that, it really calls into question, how do you curate this content? How do you monitor the quality of information that's being disseminated? On the bad news travels fast argument, that's what generates views. That's what generates impressions. What about if the bad news is fake and made up? I can categorically tell you from where we stand that there is no turnkey solution for this. There isn't a technology solution that can just be turned on to solve this problem. And the reason for that is because the platform companies are still embryonic. They are child businesses. And so they are businesses which have invented and created means for us to acquire information that's outpaced the governance of that, the acquisition of information. And I think everybody is well-intentioned within these businesses, but how we actually judge, approve content has drastically changed. So in our business, we work with, for example, broadcasters, major broadcast outlets, Comcast, Sky, for instance, and the quality of their content has historically, if you just even look at the BBC, historically been curated with a level of expertise, consulted with, verified specialists on specific topics, and user-generated content, which is the basis for most of the platforms, TikTok, you name it, is not verified. It's not under any governance, right? And I think it only deals with the extremes in some instances. So visually repulsive content, for instance, is blocked. So therefore, all of this information is being just leaked into the ether of the online ecosystem, and advertisers don't know that they are funding it. So my objective here, working with the Conscious Advertising Network and the UN, is to create awareness through a body like the United Nations, through CAN and its members, to bring attention to the need of our industry, the advertising industry, whatever you believe Google and Meta or Facebook to be, to create better awareness of this problem so that we can solve it as a community. The real power is in economics. And that's what we are finding, that if advertisers stand up and ask the platforms to be more accountable, this will be recognized, because they ultimately are funding the internet. All of us here can read articles online, watch videos, because advertisers are paying for that time to these platform companies. We take you take the $5 trillion businesses that exist, give or take, with the recent economic issues we have. 3 of them are ad-funded businesses. The fastest growing revenue line in Amazon is advertising revenue. It is the most profitable revenue line in Amazon. So $1 trillion business. Google and Meta are the same. So the people that are funding that are advertisers. Those advertisers, especially the largest global advertisers, can actually improve the quality of the internet and the world we're in. So as a business, we are trying to work with those advertisers to, for example, improve the impact of their advertising, but equally, we want to ensure that we are contributing to a better internet for all. So I think my position or argument here is that we are in an impossible situation when it comes to monitoring content, but we can try to keep doing that. However, I think with the advertiser influence and the greater awareness, we can achieve 2 things. One, we can push the platforms to improve what they're doing. And 2, I think we need to inoculate the general public from disinformation by creating awareness of bad actors. The Myanmar example that Jake gave, I think, is a well-known global example that has led to genocide, mass migration, starvation, the rape of women, and all of that was fueled through a lot of disinformation. So you could play on people's emotions to get them to drive into a mob scenario to commit crimes, heinous crimes. And that's the power that information has. And everybody is motivated by that information. When you think that that is all delivered through ad-funded businesses, it starts to call into question the responsibility of those advertisers, right, as well. So I think this is what really the argument that we have, that again, if I circle back, the open economy of information is super important. Everybody here can go and learn about what they want to learn through the online ecosystem. You can log into a platform. You can choose your method of content. Is it written text? Is it audio podcasting? Is it video on the video platforms? And you can start to access information on any given topic. The risk is when those topics are ones that change the very fabric of society, and actually the detail in there is not fact checked, it's not quality assured, it's not it's even in worse scenarios, it's designed to create chaos, it's designed to create anarchy, it's designed to create rivalry and tension, and that is real. And we know that those entities that do that on purpose to get attention are funded by advertising. They make money from the virility of that content. So I think that's really what I would put as my sort of opening gambit, that we need to all create greater awareness. And this forum, bringing attention to this topic, is really important for just trying to live in a progressive and more peaceful world and societies. This is a global epidemic. That is, the foundation of the problem is in the digital ecosystem. And it affects everyone, all parts of the planet. Nobody's immune to it. No state of society is immune to it. There's controversy in the US, in Europe, and it's all through the manipulation of content distribution online. And advertisers can impact and intercept with that. Businesses like ours can intercept that. And entities like the Conscious Advertising Network really are drumming up that momentum. And PIA and the UN as well are bringing the world's attention to it. You know, we can deal with the problem at the source of the problem, which is the conflict between communities, the impact on migrants, the impact on refugees, the impact on people who are suffering under abuse, under misrepresentation. Or we can look at the root of the problem, that everybody, most of the modern world has a mobile phone device, and they are on that device entertaining themselves with content. 73% of us that have a mobile phone device in at least an hour will go to look for new information just to keep our brain stimulated. So we need to ensure that that information is quality approved, fact checked where it can be, and definitely advertisers have a role to play, because the access to that information is only because the advertisers are paying for our freedom to download it and to read it and to watch it and to listen to it. So that's hopefully my contribution up front. Yeah, I look forward to hearing more from the other speakers.
Thank you very much, Amir, and thank you really for setting out really the vastness of the internet and the extent of the reach that we're having to deal with, but also really kind of bedding down the idea that advertisers are stakeholders in this discussion, and we really need to build, you know, that big tent to bring them in. And we'll hear from you more later. Thank you, Amir. And on that note, I'd like to turn now to Ruchira Jetli, who's joined us from Diageo India, where you are the Executive Vice President. And again, you know, so now looking at it from the point of view of the advertising, what do you see as the role, you know, in promoting responsible media, as well as in ensuring this diverse and inclusive representation? Please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Pia, and thanks for that context setting, both from Jake and Amir, because I think there is no doubt that for any advertiser, it's one of our worst nightmares to be put up against content that we, one, do not endorse, and two, possibly goes against the very fiber of the kind of society that we want to see. So that's clearly not in our best interests. What I'm going to talk about today, though, is about how advertising today is at the cusp of really building toward a lot of change. And I'm going to speak from a lot of my experiences in India, but clearly what's happening globally as well, and what we know from the Diageo world. And I'm going to talk you through, because I'm cognizant that maybe not all of us here come from the advertising world, about positive portrayal and representation as a way of countering really the kind of content, the kind of conversations that we see more and more, and some of the watchouts and learnings as well. And yes, the clicker works, so brilliant. So let me start with saying identity. It's really at the core of what we've been brought up to believe in. So what we're fighting against is the idea of who my identity is and what I believe in. And that's really the fundamental that we're all, all of us premise a lot of our thinking on. But there's been a sea change in our landscape, and these are just some, covers. But if you look at it, one, India and globally, the landscape in the last 5 years particularly has changed dramatically, with social divides being questioned, change accelerated by access and connection. So you're seeing stuff that in India on Netflix that's been created for a vastly different audience globally, in different languages, I might add. And this change has become pretty much a movement. There are parts of the country, and today when I travel in India, I see young girls dressed very much, to kind of epitomize the kind of idolization they have of, let's say, K-dramas, right? I mean, who would have thought? Because the language is so different. But that's what you're seeing across, and that's just a little bit of it. Added by the kind of conversations that are going on, enabled by the fact that you can build your own, well, one could say an echo chamber, but you could also build a group of people who you connect with, whom you can have dialogues with, regardless of where they sit geographically. And really, I'm going to skip through this one because it's a little heavy, but these are some of the influences, right? Popular culture, global movements and local footprints, businesses and brands. I mean, today, Netflix, for example, in India is the example I gave you. And there's also more equitable power that's being shared with different kinds of groups of people, empowering them. And this is not, and for everything that we say that we need to do better at, there are some things that are happening which are really, really positive. So equally, as a person in business, we would want that our brands paint a picture of society to shape it the way we see ourselves, right? Equally, the way we'd like to see society, a more vibrant, more inclusive place where we tell stories that are truly inspirational and not just about knocking things down, enabling different kinds of people, because we are different kinds of people, because we make up the business, right? We're part of the business, and that's what we want to see as well as individuals. And really, the best and the most brilliant work has shown people in authentic situations. And that's what we're seeing across. And these gather momentum. They have a momentum of their own on social networks and on media. What does that mean for a business? The first is there is a cultural opportunity like never before. It has never existed before, and it's happening. Speaking to different ethnicities, different demographies, and new age definitions of what that constitutes. So identity, which was fixed, no longer is. The second is, and I'm sorry that doesn't seem to have replicated too well, but equity and iconicity for a brand or a business that captures it right. So obviously it's there for the taking, and if you're in the right place and if you talk the right values, you do build. And I'm talking about brands like Lifebuoy, which has talked about hand wash in a campaign. Phenomenal way to get inclusion going as well. Equally, consumer recruitment and growth for the business, but that pretty much is a given, right? And therefore, what we did, I think it was about 4 years ago, was build a framework to say we want to do this cognizantly. We want to do this because we believe in it, not just as by accident. And that was about championing really what's the right kind of balance in advertising to counter maybe some of the not so nice things that you see around as well. And advertising is a very, not just a reflection of what you see in society, but very often it holds up the path to what you would like to see, right? So what was this framework about? And a lot of it is very intuitive. The first one is you need to learn and understand. Don't be ready to jump in with solutions, right? Two, once you've understood, you need to create and collaborate. And that collaboration goes across ecosystem partners because it's not about a business running things on their own. So we work with advertising guidance councils. We work with other organizations. We work with the government and with policy to say what would we like to show. And believe me, we have had these conversations in India itself with the government as well. And then execute and lead. Don't wait for someone else to run it. It's not going to happen. So that's really how we see our actions against it. And here, of course, I'm speaking on behalf of Diageo India when I put these pieces up, which is not just frameworks on how to understand what's happening, but also concepts like creative equals and creative comeback. Creative equals is about getting under or unrepresented people across the gender spectrum, across the sexual spectrum, to come in and talk about and lead creative concepts. Because if I create creatives, I'm only going to be talking to myself. Creative comeback is about women coming back after a break and talking about their experiences because they are woefully unrepresented or underrepresented in some forums. Working with unstereotype alliances, working with advertising councils, etc. And also, by the way, working with partners. Because what you can do on premise and partners like media, but equally partners, for example, hotels, key accounts. And our platform and inclusion campaigns are what we believe we do to lead. Of course, we're going to be a drop, but yeah, I mean, someone's got to start, right? By the way, innovation is being shaped dramatically by representation and with progressive portrayal. Innovation is the products we actually consume, talks to the challenges being faced by individual communities or individuals across. And this is where India sits, which is why it's interesting. Only 59% of Indians really define themselves in a binary manner in terms of heterosexuality, right? So who are we to question what people define themselves as? And as this population, as Gen Z becomes mainstream in India, this is only going to go up, right? Because you can see the numbers of people who are actually claiming they don't even know what part of the gender spectrum they sit on. And that goes up. So that's the future that's staring at all of us, and we're deeply, deeply cognizant of it. I think the progressive portrayal evaluation, and this is something we did last year, we looked at 400 pieces of advertising in India. And what we found was not really great news for us, right? Look at this. Ethnic representation, 22%, specially abled, 3 out of 400, not even percent, right? That's less than 1%. And gender spectrum, 1. Yeah, best performing. Women, 35% of categories do not have basic representation of women. We're talking about, and this is Asia Pac, right? PR, like you said, it's a unique microcosm of nations and countries. So, and 31% who did had very hackneyed, very stereotypical portrayals of people. Of course, there are people who are doing a lot of work, but there's a long way for us to go. How are we going to do it? And this is what I do, right? This is how I evaluate what I put out as content and where I want to be seen, to add to what Jake was saying. I do it through representation. Show them. You can't, and I'm using Black Panther here as an example of representation, one of the most powerful examples that have come across in the last couple of years. Perspective. Show it from a different person's perspective. Agency, I mean, why should men have all the fun? Look at Killing Eve, but look at the agency it gave women, that particular piece of program. And I've deliberately used content that we all consume as a way of showing what are the kind of influences that people are looking at today, and characterization. Characterization, which gives you deeper stories, context. I believe this is important. I believe this is what makes a difference at breaking down tropes, breaking down stereotypes, and doing it and delivering it in a manner which is, well, which people want to consume. And therefore, the Unstereotype Alliance, we are very proud signatories and members of it, but equally, so are large businesses, some of which Jake spoke about. And it's about a mix of panels such as this, impact events, and bringing alive philosophies. But there are lots of learnings that come from this, right? One is, it is slow, and this is not about equality anymore, but this is about equity, having a seat at the table and having your voice heard and making impact. The second is, journeys are different by category, by individual. So there is no single way in which you're going to make it happen. And at various stages, you have to listen and champion. Because if you don't listen and you go on and power on and say, this is the way I think it's done, you could be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The other one was voices. It's interesting. Across the country, and India is such a diverse country, and then across Diageo globally, we live in very similar contexts. It's the basic fundamentals of what we want. but we're forced to live these contexts very differently. And that's really the reality of where we are. And in that context, therefore, there are deep-rooted fissures. There are differences in communities. So you need to deliver this with balance. Otherwise, in its entirety, the message will be ignored. And those are the kind of challenges that we confront really as marketers and advertisers. And to sum up, and I hope I haven't taken up too much time, but we really aren't defined by one anymore, right? So I guess I'm coming at this at a very different lens to say, yes, there are challenges. Yes, there is content there that is absolutely abhorrent, and we have to be able to control how we put out our advertising there. But equally, the what of the advertising, right? I mean, so imagine if on one of those pieces of, those various examples that you shared, if there was a wonderful piece of content that brought alive the richness of diversity. That kind of is counterintuitive to someone who's watching it, right? So there is a role to be played by business and advertisers in bringing alive the right dialogues and actually doing it with a framework that talks through how we're going to address it and do it meaningfully, step by step, brand by brand, piece of content on. So that was really what I had to say, and cheers. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ruchira. And exactly, I think it is about, we have to have that balance, build a vision of the world that you want to see, the community that you want to live in. And I really, the more that I work in this space from the human rights side, I see advertisers as society storytellers and as, kind of putting that vision, as you say, forward and bringing that representation. And thank you also for the evidence, the evidence that you brought to say that this is a concern for you and it's something you're interrogating through the work that you're doing. Thank you very much for that. Now I'd like to turn to, we need the clicker this way, I'd like to turn to Pat De Bruyn, who is researcher and advisor on artificial intelligence and human rights at Amnesty International. It's a pleasure to have you. And I'd like you, from the civil society perspective, from Amnesty's perspective, to tell us as well about the concerns that you're seeing around online advertising practices. And particularly, we're here in the Asia Pacific region. We know that there are certain people that are more at risk of harm from human rights violations in this context. I would really like to hear about some of the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Pia, and thanks to Jake, Amir, and Ruchira for those really insightful presentations. Today, I would like to speak about the global advertising industry, as others have touched upon, but from a human rights perspective. I want to speak specifically about how prevailing practices, specifically in the tech sector and among big tech companies, the major players in the advertising industry, Facebook and Google, are fueling human rights harms and risks globally, and notably here in the Asia region as well, and how these are really impacting the most marginalized and at-risk groups in the world. So as it stands today, there are two companies in the world, two enormously powerful companies, Facebook and Google, that control the access to the internet for most of us, to the basic services that we rely upon online, including search, social media, messaging, video, and mobile. And billions of people around the world rely on these services and on these companies. But these are also not just social media and tech companies, they're the biggest advertising players in the world. And this is something that we don't always appreciate as users of these platforms. But 80% roughly of Google's revenue comes from advertising, and 98% of Meta or Facebook's revenue comes from advertising as well. And ultimately, most of the severe human rights harms that have been linked to these businesses are rooted in their advertising practices. And I want to talk through some of how that operates in practice and how that fuels some of the most severe human rights harms that we're seeing today around the world. So these companies' business model it's based on the collection and exploitation of vast oceans of personal data. These companies want to get to know us intimately. The services that they provide are nominally free, but in reality, we pay a huge cost. In fact, as I will demonstrate, these companies, Facebook and Google, Their pervasive surveillance and profiling of billions of people is posing a systemic threat to our human rights, and much of this links back to the world of online advertising. Our position at Amnesty is that this model, targeted advertising, is inherently incompatible with human rights because of the inherent risk that it poses to the right to privacy. But I also want to focus today on the other human rights risks presented by this model beyond privacy, including the right to life, the right to freedom from discrimination, torture, and other severe human rights harms. In fact, these business practices and targeted advertising are driving violent extremism, conflict, hatred, disinformation, and discrimination all around the world. These are the severe risks that I want to focus on now, and I'm going to speak specifically about one particular case study, because at Amnesty Tech, we've been working on an investigation throughout this year, and a report will be coming out next week, looking specifically into the role that Facebook or Meta played in the ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya population of Myanmar in 2017. So, as many of you will have noticed, it was recently the 5-year anniversary of the Rohingya ethnic cleansing, the crisis in Rakhine State that occurred in 2017. This was a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing by the Myanmar military, where Rohingya Muslims were killed in their thousands, where women and girls were raped, people were tortured, and over 700,000 Rohingya people were forced from their homeland and across the border into refugee camps in Bangladesh, where most of them linger to this day. The vast majority of the population were forced from their homes and have been unable to return. So at the time, the role of Facebook was already known to be quite prominent, and even the UN investigative mechanism that looked into this crisis found in 2018 that the role of social media was significant in the atrocities perpetrated against the Rohingya. It also recommended that the extent to which Facebook posts and messages led to real-world discrimination and violence must be independently and thoroughly examined. And this report that we're putting out next week is taking up that call and seeking to interrogate exactly the extent to which Facebook and its core technologies, which are inherently linked to its online advertising business, have fueled those severe harms suffered by the Rohingya population and continue to pose a risk to other communities all around the world and in the Asia region. So briefly, before I speak about the findings of this report and how it links back to the online advertising world, I just want to briefly touch upon the guiding legal framework. We are here in a business and human rights space, and Amnesty, as a human rights organization, our investigations are always based on international human rights law and standards. And the key framework here is the UN guiding principles on business and human rights. And the key questions that we had to ask when looking into what really was the responsibility of Facebook for these harms, beyond a rhetorical responsibility, beyond a vague moral responsibility. What is the legal responsibility here? And does the company actually owe a remedy to affected communities? Does it owe reparations to those who have suffered and those who have been displaced and suffered untold harms? So the questions we had to ask were, what is Meta's responsibility under international human rights law and standards? And did its contribution did its actions reach the threshold of contribution under the UN guiding principles? And that would, if so, that would trigger the responsibility to remediate affected communities. Now, the investigation findings, some of this is well known already, so I'll run through it quickly, but hate speech, incitement to violence, advocacy of hatred against the Rohingya was rife on Facebook in the years and months leading up to the atrocities in 2017. The Myanmar military and their allies were the key actors in systematically flooding the Facebook platform with this type of anti-Rohingya hate. And the prevalence of this content played a really significant role in the violence that ensued by creating an enabling environment for mass violence, as other speakers have briefly touched upon. Now, our investigation found that Meta utterly failed to mitigate human rights risks, including by failing in its content moderation efforts. And we catalogued the efforts of local activists who, from 2012 to 2017, repeatedly sought action from Facebook, who warned them that a genocide was looming and that the company needed to take urgent action to prevent being complicit in a human rights crisis. Unfortunately, the company failed to act appropriately in response. And I have a quote here from one very prominent Myanmar digital rights activist and a leader in the space who was very active in seeking action from Facebook. And she told Amnesty that, you know, we warned them at every opportunity. They didn't care. They ignored us for a long time and then just focused on PR solutions. They seemed to care more about their own reputational risk than they really did about addressing the problems. This was also happening inside the country. Rohingya people could see the huge deluge of anti-Rohingya content that was flooding the platform. And we interviewed survivors, refugees who are currently residing in refugee camps in Bangladesh about this. And they told us repeatedly the same story, that their efforts to report content, hate speech directed against them on Facebook were met with inaction. And as Sayedullah, one of these survivors and activists, told us, he tried to report such hate speech, but he just got a response that said it did not go against community standards. That made me really angry. I realized that it's not just those people, the posters, but Facebook is also responsible. Facebook is responsible by helping them by not taking care of their platform. And this was a powerful message that we received again and again from survivors. But I want to now pivot to, this is an important part of the story, but it's a part that's relatively well known. I want to now pivot back to assessing the link between Facebook's business model, its targeted advertising business, and how that led to such content being actively promoted, hate speech against the Rohingya being promoted by Facebook's technologies in the context of this crisis. So Meta eventually, when I say Meta, I mean Facebook, the same company, admitted in 2018 that they weren't doing enough to help prevent the platform being used by bad actors. And this has been the dominant narrative ever since, that, you know, they didn't do enough, they didn't have enough content moderators, and they were unprepared for an unprecedented crisis. But what I want to focus on now is really the core of this research, which we'll be producing next week, is that Facebook's algorithms, that means the core technologies that power the platform and which are prevalent across the big tech sector, actively amplified and promoted anti-Rohingya hate. And they delivered it right to the people who are most likely to act on this incitement to violence. And this fact, the nature of these technologies, the algorithms that are powering the Facebook platform and which are prevalent across the big tech sector, are there because they're incredibly lucrative. Ultimately, these companies work by trying to keep us on their platforms for as long as possible. Therefore, their technologies are optimized and designed in such a way to show us the most engaging, inflammatory, and addictive content possible. Now, research has shown again and again that this type of approach leads to the most harmful content, including hate speech and incitement to violence, being prioritized. And the root cause of this prioritization ultimately is because the more time we spend on the platform, the more advertising revenue the company will receive and the more ads that it can sell. So going back to the root cause of this business model, we can see that there's a direct link between targeted advertising within Meta and Facebook and across the big tech companies and these very severe human rights harms. Now, in this report, we've looked deeply into the Facebook papers, which are an evidence source that have recently come to light late last year. Some of you may be familiar with the Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, who disclosed a lot of internal information about how the company works. And this has enabled us to reach more far-reaching conclusions about, you know, the real extent of Facebook's role in the atrocities perpetrated against the Rohingya. And very briefly, I think this quote from those papers sums it up. The mechanics of our platform are not neutral. And that is really a key message that comes from the Facebook papers. These are not companies who are passively and neutrally delivering content and selling ads. They are promoting and prioritizing and recommending specific types of content because that is more profitable. And this research shows, and internal company documents reveal, that this is disproportionately promoting hate speech, incitement to violence, disinformation, and the most extreme and harmful types of content that have been repeatedly linked to real-world human rights crises, as we saw so prominently and tragically in the case of the Rohingya. So I want to briefly touch on one example from the Facebook papers linked to Myanmar. There was one case in which a video involving the very infamous and prominent hate figure Uveratu, who is a radical Buddhist monk, part of the Mabata network, who was a key figure inciting violence against the Rohingya and really a prominent actor in the lead up to the 2017 atrocities. Now, this is a few years later, after he was actually banned from the platform, but a video in which he was inciting anti-Rohingya violence was escalated through user complaints, and Facebook then considered what was happening with this video, and their internal investigation found that 70% of that video's views had come from what's known as chaining. That means that this was not organic or natural that people were viewing the content. This means that the company was actively recommending this divisive and inciting content. 70% of the views had come from that. And this is the kind of takeaway that we have from the Facebook papers that lead us to draw certain conclusions about the nature of Facebook's contribution to the Rohingya crisis, but also how this entire business model is fueling severe human rights harms across the world, and how the fundamentals of this surveillance-based advertising, targeted advertising, is creating these unpredictable risks, but really some of the most severe human rights catastrophes of our generation. And in terms of what we could conclude in this report, absolutely Meta has contributed to the violence suffered by the Rohingya, and it does owe a remedy, and that will be the campaign that we're launching next week to call for Meta to pay reparations to Rohingya communities in line with their human rights responsibilities under the guiding principles. But I also want to highlight that, this happened 5 years ago, but the fundamentals of this system have not changed. Across this region and across the world, Facebook continues to pose a threat, a real and present threat to human rights, as do other big tech companies. And it's because of these destructive business models that really need to be fundamentally addressed in order to prevent the recurrence of these really severe human rights catastrophes. And it starts with addressing targeted advertising and the normalization of that business model that has been shown to fuel such harms. I'll close with a quote that we received from another Rohingya survivor, Shokutara, who's a 22-year-old resident of one of the refugee camps in Bangladesh. And it just speaks to the strength of that community and their efforts to pursue justice. She told us that Facebook must pay. If they do not, we will go to every court in the world, and we will never give up in our struggle. I thank you for your time. I hope that was not too long, but I also hope we got to zoom out and look at some of the fundamental issues in this advertising ecosystem. And yeah, I appreciate it, your time.
Thank you very much, Pat, and thank you really for taking us through that journey and helping us understand exactly what the real life, real world harms are, and pointing the need for the fundamental reforms, because I think that's where we're going to get, to a solution. I'd like to finally turn to Victoire Rio, who is the Senior Advisor for the Myanmar Internet Project, and to hear from your perspective, from the local perspective as well, what some of the issues are that are coming up and some of your thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks you. Thank you very much, Pia, and thanks everybody. I am coming at this issue of advertising from a digital rights and tech accountability perspective. As Pia mentioned, I was based in Myanmar from 2015 to 2021, spearheading a lot of the civil society efforts that Pat just mentioned. But I I want to talk about another side of advertising, perhaps, that we haven't touched on too much today. Not so much Facebook and Google being a place where you can put ads on, well, those platforms are accepting ads on their own platforms, but there's only so much space on their newsfeed or on their own services to place ad. And so what has happened over the last few years is these platforms have also expanded into being ad exchanges, which is what Jake referred to earlier, where they essentially work with publishers as well to place content, to place advertising on other publishers' content. So what I have up here is a sort of the timeline of how some of those programs came into the region. Sort of starting with Google AdSense quite a while ago, 2008, and then moving on to, 2003, then YouTube Partner Program, and then more recently, sort of Facebook getting into a lot of those programs that have rolled out at different points in time. And now what those programs are essentially is those platforms connecting a range of publishers that are producing either web content or video content to the advertising industry, and placing those ads on their content. And it's a way to expand their ability to run ads beyond their own newsfeed and their own services. Now, what this has led to, in the context of Myanmar specifically, but more broadly around the region, we're actually missing the fundamental part, but it's really fueled the rise of a growing disinformation economy. We have a growing amount of disinformation in Myanmar, but more broadly in the region, that's actually not politically motivated, but content that is being produced or published purely with a view to make money and to get you to look at it, to click on it. What's not showing on the current screen is we've seen actors in the region make up to $12,000 a month from a single page. Many of them are managing multiple presences. That's a lot of money for young people in this region. We have hundreds, thousands of people in the region now turning to this line of work as a way to make money, and pretty substantial money as well. And they're producing content not because it is content that, not because they're passionate about a topic or because they are creators that want to put content in front of you, but the sole purpose is to get you to click so that they can actually make more money. Now, this has been a major challenge for us, and particularly in the context of Myanmar, just sort of building on what Pat mentioned, one thing that hasn't been talked about much in the context of the Rohingya genocide is the fact that Facebook rolled out instant article rights in between actually in April of 2016, when the situation in Rakhine was not so good already. Facebook rolled out instant article with very little guardrails, if any. What that has meant is we've seen a number of new stakeholders sort of emerge in this publishing space. A lot of people starting to produce content purely to get clicks. And a lot of that content was instrumental in mainstreaming a lot of the anti-Rohingya narratives. A lot of that content was also instrumental in the aftermath of the attacks in really sensationalizing the situation and really sort of making things worse. Same thing with YouTube, and YouTube sort of in the Myanmar context came a bit later, but over the last couple of years, there's been a big uptake in YouTube, and that has been a key driver of disinformation in the Myanmar context. Now, as you know, Myanmar had a coup in February of 2021. Situation's been very tense since. We are bombarded with content along the line of Min Aung Hlaing's been sentenced to death. The UN has landed in northern Chin State and is about to come and save the country. Those narratives are everywhere. We're looking at videos getting millions of views on a daily basis. And those narratives are being developed and put online by people that are not necessarily political. And those are people that are just trying to capitalize on the situation to get us to click. Perhaps the last one is the one that personally touches me the most. Facebook launched its ability to monetize live video. So publishing live videos were unable to actually register so that they could place ads on their live video and make money out of those live videos. That launched in March of 2021. That's exactly when the protests in Myanmar started getting cracked down. Now, I was in Yangon at the time, watching these live videos as a way to get news from my friends and see what was happening in the city, but quite quickly discovered that these videos were actually not live. What was happening was a bunch of people out of Cambodia that had absolutely no knowledge of the context were downloading these videos off of YouTube and reposting them onto Facebook purely to make money. So you had millions of people watching videos thinking these were live events happening in their city amidst a brutal crackdown. And those videos they were true, they were real videos, they had been shot a few days before, but they certainly weren't happening live. And so the last trend linked to that I want to stress is a lot of it is getting internationalized. So those videos that were being pushed into Myanmar, they were actually being pushed by 4 guys in Phnom Penh, Cambodia, that had no knowledge of the context, do not speak any Burmese, as far as we can tell. But I discovered that the Myanmar market was a very lucrative market because people were very engaged at that point in time, and because everybody was using VPNs, which made them look like they were in America and made their attention more valuable than a normal Burmese user would normally have. So just to stress, this is an industry that's growing, that platforms are, and well, beyond actually this being a growing industry that's increasingly international, those players in Cambodia that are operating in Myanmar, we've seen them operate in Japan, we've seen them operate in the US, we've seen them operate in Ukraine, we've seen actors coming out of Vietnam. You don't need to actually understand the content, all you need to do is to know where to find content to steal and how to put that content back where it's going to make the most money. And that's sort of what we are looking at here. And it's incredibly important because that has tremendously increased the volume of disinformation and problematic content we're dealing with. But also it has it's a tremendous volume that is actually starting, but also its volume and its actors that would not exist and would not be doing this if it wasn't for the ability to make money out of it. So this is, as Jake said earlier, you know, it's funding the disinformation industry, but it's not just funding existing actors that are producing disinformation, it's actually creating new actors, new players, and at a very, very fast pace. So I'll stop there, but thank you.
Thank you very much, Victoire, and indeed for taking us through that disinformation economy, and again, the real life harms and the complexity, I think, of the issue that we're dealing with. And thank you again to all the panelists. This was such a fascinating discussion. I really didn't want it to end. We've only got a few minutes, but I will try and take 1 or 2 questions. And I know that we have a request for the floor online from Jason Lambert, who's the Senior Director at Internews. So maybe, Jason, if you could come in, and I'll take 1 more.
Yeah, hello, and thank you for giving me the floor, and thank you for the invitation. I'd just like to share some things that we've been doing here at Internews that could be relevant. I'll just take a couple of minutes to give you the highlights. We at Internews, we're a 40-year-old organization. We operate in 106 countries and 136 languages last year. And really everything we do is about nurturing the creation of fact-based news and information. So we're an organization focused on combating disinformation really from the heart. And what I would like to just share is that there are some things that we're seeing that are working in this space and how we can work together to make some more progress. So what we did a couple of years ago is we created an initiative called Ads for News. And Ads for News creates country-based lists of trusted news and information providers. And we use our own in-country networks of researchers and journalists to create these lists with local partners as well. So it's based on deep local knowledge. And we also index these sites according to industry standards like the Global Alliance for Responsible Media, GARM. What I'm seeing is that the problems facing news are really many, and why do we need to focus on supporting trusted local news and information? It's that this is really a foundation of democracy, and for major brands like Diageo and many of the others that we talk to, of course, it's a foundation of stable markets that you can get into and sell products into. The more stable a market, the easier it is to sell into those and to be in those markets. What we're seeing working is that we have these conversations at many different levels, and the very encouraging thing is that being present in conversations like this, it makes it known that this is something that we need to do something about. And we can say that retrospectively that Google and Meta are the problem, but these are 18 and 25-year-old businesses, and it's about time that we've kind of caught up with that and figured out how to handle the presence of these organizations in our space. Very quickly, the things that we saw happening were that businesses are increasingly aware that they need to participate in markets responsibly. We saw a very different set of reactions in the way that companies exited Russia following its invasion of Ukraine. And that to us really suggested that there's a movement around this, that this concept of social profit, that organizations and brands recognize the interlinkage between having a positive impact on society and deriving financial profit. And this is actually backed up by a study from Yale University, where they found that the share price of those companies that exited Russia has been positively affected by that move. Anyway, in order for us to make progress with sending making sure that more funds come to away from disinformation and towards trusted sources of news, we have lots of partnerships. We have a great partnership with Group M that gives us insights from the industry on how we need to position this or to make this as a product that brands will engage with. And the other main part of it, which I see that Jake and Conscious Advertising Network really focus on, is measurability. So what we would call for here is that brands undertake to set aside an amount of their advertising budgets towards known providers of trusted news and information, and that they become accountable for measuring that and reporting that out to the sector, because it's an extremely valuable thing. And if you don't measure it, you can't manage it. And that's the way that we're seeing that the progress is happening. So yeah, just to summarize, we're at the coalface of this work. We are seeing progress. We see a shifting tide, I think, in the way that brands and everyone really is having these conversations, facilitated by things like Biden's Democracy Summit and the USAID, the US Agency for International Development, all of whom support these initiatives in a big way. So please, if we can be of any use in these conversations, do come to us here at Int News and our Ads for News initiative. And Pierre, thank you.
Thank you very much, Jason. That was a really important perspective. I can take one question from the floor, and I see the young lady behind there. Please go ahead.
Hello. So I'm a university student from India, and thank you so much for all the points that all the panelists brought. I mean, I think my generation feels this firsthand because we've grown up with social media all around us. And I mean, it's all we've known, so we love it so much. But like when we see these ads on social media platforms, it's so hard to see what is real and what is fake, because we see all of these big companies and we see that, if they are actually advertising here, is the information really real and is it legitimate? So how do I, as a citizen and user of the internet, make sure that the information I'm seeing is actually accurate? Because we're seeing all of these advertisers come. And secondly, what do I do to ensure, like, for example, like with COVID vaccines, there was so much misinformation. What do I ensure that the information is actually fact-checked and like legitimate? So yeah, thank you so much for the panel also.
Thank you very much. And I'm really sorry, we really don't have time for more questions, but I'm sure the speakers can engage with you all afterwards. Can I give the floor to our panelists in turn? And maybe you can also reflect on the excellent question from the young lady, but also one thing.
Pia, I'm sorry, but you are intentionally ignoring me.
I'm so sorry, madam. We really don't have time. Can you engage with the panel afterwards, please? Thank you. Please, Ruchira.
I want to speak. I raised my hands first. You saw me, but you ignored me.
I'm so sorry, madam. Can I give you the floor later then, please, once the panel has managed to speak? Thank you very much.
Yes, please make sure.
Please, Ruchira, you have the floor. Just one suggestion for taking things forward, and from the young lady there, please.
I think partnering with networks like Jason said, like Jake has mentioned, I think we have to build an ecosystem that's about getting to verified and trusted, and also asking for the details, because that's when you can at least safeguard your own presence, and we can help, for example, the young lady there. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that this is, an attempt to build a big tent to both look and identify the problems within this ecosystem. So one of the pieces of work that we're doing is actively engaging with the platforms. I'll give you an example on climate, with climate mis and disinformation that is going, again, spreading around the world, that apparently climate change is not existing and isn't caused at all by humans. We've been working with Google on a global climate misinformation policy that was rolled out towards the end of 2021, which effectively removes the monetization of content that denies the existence of climate change. So it's not about free speech, it's not removing that content entirely, it's not deplatforming, but it is removing that profit incentive, because we talk a lot about, everybody's got the right to free speech, but you don't have the inalienable right to be promoted by an algorithm. That's not in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, nor do you have the inalienable right to earn money. So there's a question about how do we define what is mis and disinformation with local context. How does that then feed into policy? How is that then enforced, and better enforced, with local language translation and local people on the ground to identify those problems? And how do we report transparently? There needs to be a better job in terms of monetization being a privilege, and having better due diligence across all of these platforms to make sure that the content that we receive and the content that we all depend on is verifiable and trusted, and isn't determined by this profit motive.
Thanks, Pia. Two very brief points. I think in terms of the solutions, we need to be serious about state regulation. I mean, it's a basic principle of international human rights law that states have a responsibility to protect us from harms that would be caused to our rights by corporates. And it remains the case today that the digital sphere is a veritable Wild West when it comes to regulations. There have been some minor developments, and I think in the EU, the DSA recently is a pretty significant development, but we're yet to see it, come into force. Major regulation is required in order to rein in the most destructive aspects, the root causes of many of these harms. And I think, as I was speaking to before, that would have to address invasive profiling and targeted advertising. And related to that, I would say that this doesn't mean the end of the free internet. There are alternatives available, but big tech spends a lot of money, and in fact more than any other sector in the world, on lobbying to convince us that this will be the end of the free internet. But there's a lot of research out there to show that alternative models are just as effective, and in fact just as profitable for advertisers. There are multiple examples where brands, companies have shifted towards contextual advertising. So that means if I'm searching for shoes, I find your ad for a shoe brand on that page. It doesn't have to follow me around my life online and offline and know more about me than I know about myself in order to sell me that pair of shoes. So this entire model based on an abuse of human rights does not need to exist. There are alternatives available, and we need to regulate to make sure that happens.
And I'll just add to that, and to the point on regulation, regulated transparency will also be very critical. At the moment, we're only able to see who is publishing and monetizing for their publishing on Facebook. There is no transparency on YouTube and other platforms. And to the point of the young lady over there, there is a lot of knowledge within the local communities around what particular publishers are problematic. But many of these publishers are still able to register for monetization. So having transparencies that enables civil society to take a look and really deep dive into some of the those actors that are publishing, and be able to actually convey that message up to the companies so that they can make sure that those actors are not monetizing and making money to support and fuel disinformation.
Thank you very much to the panelists. I'm sorry, we were not going to have time to take your question now.